having him. And also, I'd like to thank First Evangelical for hosting the event. I'd like to outline the program that we have for you tonight. First, the speakers will start out with a 20-minute presentation each, followed by a 10-minute response from each one, and then a guided conversation with me for about 40 minutes, and then a Q&A with you. And so, speaking of that, as the speakers are giving their presentation, if you're thinking of questions to ask them, if you could jot them down, and then when we begin the guided conversation, the ushers will come, they'll pick them up, and then during the Q&A session, we can ask them. So, and also some guidelines if you could, if you turn off your cell phones, and also applauses, or if you could try to refrain from interrupting the speakers during their allotted time. So, with that, let me present the bios for the speakers. First person is Eric Hernandez. He's actually a former student of mine. Eric is a dynamic, young evangelistic, and apologetically inclined teacher. He has a passion for defending his faith on both theologically and philosophical grounds. He is a licensed minister, certified formation therapist, and currently teaches at McGill Bible Institute. He is well respected and sought after for his expository ability and insight into apologetics, as he had taken this to various countries and states that the Lord has led him to. He has spoken openly and debated on public level in universities and colleges, where he adamantly and adequately defends the Christian faith against atheist, agnostic, and deistic professors of different worldviews. He holds an associate degree in social science, a bachelor's degree in theology, and is currently working on his certificate in apologetics from Iowa. Our second speaker is Mr. Dan Flores. Mr. Flores received his MA in philosophy, where he wrote a thesis on the regress and aponitum objection regarding causation and theory of dispensationalism. I'll let you let that sink in. His second MA in interdisciplinary studies focused on the intersection between behavioral and evolutionary concepts in biology, brain behavior in neuropsychology, and philosophical analysis of the theory of memetics, the theory of the cultural transmission and inheritance of information, specifically the behavior. As a former Catholic and devout believer in religious and doctrinal authority, Professor Flores made a turn away from faith-based belief through his studies of science, philosophy, and comparative mythology, and through an increasing political plight awareness. Starting from a common experiential position that our experiences and knowledge are rooted in the natural world, Professor Flores maintains that there is no justification for the belief that God exists. Furthermore, whether God exists or not is not relevant to the question of morality and the belief in moral propositions. God or no God, humans do and should continue to praise and to blame. The merits of praise and blame, nonetheless, are rooted in human experience and reasoning. And in other words, there is good reason to think that morality is a perfectly natural phenomenon stemming from human interaction, experience, and reason. With that, I'd like to invite Mr. Hernandez to give his presentation first.
Good evening. I'd first like to say what an honor it is to be here, to Pastor Evan and to Professor Flores and Professor Lamb for being here with us and agreeing to this. You know, it's going to be an interesting night. It has got to be a God thing when you have only one Christian on the stage and two atheist philosophy professors joining me. With a room full of believers and non-believers, I want to tell you up front, to the Christians, I want you to think about your faith a little bit deeper. To the non-believers, I'm here to put a pebble in your shoe because I want to make your walk uncomfortable. I want to make you think about what you believe and assess what you believe. Again, thank you to Professor Flores for entering into this den of lambs and agreeing to join in this debate. The first thing I'd like to point out is what tonight's topic will not be about. Tonight's topic is not about reasons people follow God. Psychology behind religious beliefs. Is the Bible accurate? Does belief in God make you a better person? All topics which are interesting, but if Professor Flores brings up any objections regarding this would be what you would call a red hearing, and pretty much irrelevant to the topic of tonight. But rather, tonight's topic is a very interesting and deep philosophical one, namely, is God necessary? G.W. Leibniz, who was a great philosopher, once said, the first question which should fundamentally be asked is, why does anything exist rather than nothing? He distinguished between two types of things that exist. Things that exist necessarily, which means they are things that have to exist and do not depend on anything else for their existence. And he distinguished between things that exist contingently, which is to say something that does not have to exist, could fail to exist, or depends on an external cause for its existence. So for example, something that is necessary, like a necessary truth, for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4, since it is necessary, it can't begin to exist, so it would make no sense to ask, when did 2 plus 2 start equaling 4? Or perhaps in the future, will we later on find out that 2 and 2 no longer equals 4, or if I travel to the other side of the universe, will 2 plus 2 no longer equal 4? This is a necessary truth. Contrast that with contingent truths, that is to say, things that don't have to exist. This building, perhaps yourself, if your parents would have met someone else, or something would not have worked out, or perhaps even consummated on a different day, you probably would not exist. So there is nothing necessary about your existence. To give an analogy, let's say I had a gas tank and I needed some gas. So I go to person A and I say, could I borrow some gas? And he says, well, I don't have any, but let me talk to person B. Person B says the same thing, moves on to person C, and so forth. If eventually an hour later person A comes to me and offers me gas, he says, I got your gas, what this implies is that eventually, somewhere down the line, that there got to a point, a person, where this person did not have to borrow gas from somebody else, rather he had already had the gas and didn't need to ask, otherwise I would never get my gas. My point to that is for absolutely anything at all to exist, since we borrow existence, me from my parents and so forth, for anything at all to exist, there has to have been some stopping point in the past that something has always existed and never borrowed existence from anything else. We call him God. That is what you call a necessary being. So for mere existence, as J.P. Moreland, philosopher, said, if God did not exist, nothing would exist because everything owes its existence to God in one way or another. That is to say, literally nothing would exist if God did not exist. If you look, for example, at our universe, we know that through modern cosmology that our universe did in fact begin. Now, what is our universe composed of? 3 things: time, space, and matter. So if we apply the, as William and Craig does in an argument, the cosmological argument, the metaphysical principle that everything that begins to exist needs a cause, and the universe began to exist, and the universe needed a cause, we could then logically deduce that if the universe needed a cause, and it began, therefore would need a cause, then something timeless, spaceless, and immaterial would be needed to cause it. I can even go further and say timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal, since it made a decision to create, and unimaginably powerful, since it created something out of nothing. I'd like to change the mood just a little bit and look at what has been deemed as one of the strongest objections to God's existence, namely evil. However, I would like to argue that to say anything is evil, you would have to assume that God exists in order to say that he can't exist because there's evil. For these reasons, because evil assumes at least 2 things. The first thing evil assumes is that there is an objective moral standard of good. That is to say that something is actually evil because it's deviating from good. And it assumes that there is teleology to life, which is basically a design to which things ought to function and flourish. If we could take a look at the first assumption, if I say that somebody is lying, by the very implication that I am saying that they are lying, I am implying that there is a truth to which they are deviating. So a lie cannot exist unless there is some truth. We can all imagine a world where truth exists without any lies, but if a lie exists, it logically implies that there must be some truth out there to which the lie is deviating. The same can be said of evil. If evil exists, you are assuming there is a standard for good to which this evil is deviating. The second thing, well, to stay on the first, another argument by William Lane Craig, a variation of the moral argument, goes as follows. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, if God does not exist, there is no such thing as right or wrong. Well, we know that evil exists. And if we assume evil exists, there must be a good and an evil, which would imply that therefore objective moral values and duties do in fact exist, and therefore God exists. As C.S. Lewis, a former atheist, once said, something that brought him to theism was evil. He said, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has an idea of what a straight line looks like." Now, for the atheist, there is a default position, because there are many atheist philosophers, academic scholars, who agree with this argument and say that's true. If there were no God, there would be no morality. Therefore, there is no morality because there is no God. This is the position of nihilism. That is to say, the atheist position that many atheist philosophers and scholars have come to, again, that there is no such thing as morality because there is no such thing as God. Let me quote a few for you. Michael Roos, an amazing philosopher who is an atheist, actually affirms this. He says the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Here's an atheist philosopher, one of the best in my opinion, saying, absolutely right, morality is just something we came up with to survive. There is no objectivity to it, and if you think so, it's just an illusion. So quote another famous atheist who is a scientist, Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion, "There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference." Now let's look at the second assumption that evil makes. If a child were born colorblind, we would say he has a disease. Now, a disease means a disorder of structure or function, which would imply a teleology, which is a design by which things ought to function and flourish, which would imply a designer, namely God. So in summation, evil actually presupposes that God exists, in that it assumes at least two things. Again, a lack of objective good, because good can only exist if there is a transcendent grounding for it, namely God. And that it is a deviation of teleology, which implies that there are some things that are not functioning and flourishing the way it was designed to, which again would mean that there is a designer. Now let's look at something else that's quite interesting. If there is morality, then we should have moral responsibility. But to have moral responsibility, we would need something called free will. Now there are a lot of atheists that reject this. I'm not sure Professor Flores' position, but in my opinion, the most logical position for an atheist to take is the position of determinism, which is the view that human beings are purely physical machines, but physical machines have to operate by physical law and therefore have no free will and cannot be held more responsible for their actions. Now, if you're shaking your head, I can understand that this is the conclusion of atheism, not mine. Based on two views in atheism, called physicalism and naturalism, which, if I'm not mistaken, in the bio I heard Professor Flores is a naturalist. The physicalist view is that the view that nothing beyond the physical world exists, the view of naturalism, that everything arises from natural properties and causes, and supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. To quote philosopher J.P. Moreland once again, he says, "If there is no freedom, how can there be moral responsibility? If you are a physicalist and the only thing you believe in is matter, and must believe that a human being is composed of nothing but matter, there would be no room for freedom of the will, because physical machines cannot act freely. They behave according to the laws of chemistry and physics." He goes on to say, if I shoot a bullet in the air, does it say, I'm tired of obeying Newton's laws of motion, let me swerve left? Why? Well, because it's a physical thing. And what can be said of the bullet can be said of anything that is purely physical. But if you have freedom, there has to be something more to you that has the freedom other than matter, namely what we would call your soul, something immaterial that can act on the physical. This is the position of dualism, which is a claim that we as humans are composed of a physical substance and a spiritual or immaterial substance. And this would account for free will, your mind, and consciousness. Aristotle used a wonderful illustration. He said, if I move a rock with a staff, the staff moved the rock, I moved the staff, but what moved me? Now, an atheist might say, well, clearly we can look at your brain and say that a neuron firing happened and it made you move your hand to move the staff, to move the rock. But all you would have to do is ask, well, what made that neuron fire the other one? And then once you answer that, what neuron firing made the neuron firing made the other neuron firing to make your hand move? So clearly there has to, if there is free will, there has to be something immaterial other than your physical body to act on your body for us to even have free will in the first place. If I want to lift my left arm, I simply do it freely. Nothing makes me. There may be a correlation in my brain, but if there is no God, there is nothing immaterial and nothing to give me that. Therefore, again, the atheist default position, determinism. For example, we can see this with our brain. Our brain is not our mind. They are different. How so? I can measure a brain state. You can have a mass or weight. However, I can't measure a thought. It makes no sense to ask how many inches long is the thought of the grass being green. How many pounds is the taste of banana? How many inches long is the smell of rose? These things just don't make sense. They are category fallacies. Another thing about the brain state and mental states, a thought can be true or false. I can have a thought, does God exist? That can be true or false. But if I look at what's going on in my brain, a C-fire brain or something to that effect, you cannot look at your brain firing and say that brain firing right there is true or that brain firing is false. Why? Because the brain and mind are simply two different things. Most definitely there's a correlation, but they are not the same. Another interesting note about atheism, and I'm showing that God is necessary if we want to keep these beliefs, because if God doesn't exist, there's something very hard for the atheist. In the field of philosophy, there's something called epistemology, which is a study of knowledge and how it is obtained. To know anything, according to epistemology, you must first have a justification for why you believe something without any good defeaters for it. Now, the reason this is very interesting is that this becomes a real problem for the atheist. Why? Because he has a defeater for any belief he may hold that his brain tells him. Scientist, atheist J.B.S. Haldane said, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact that it is made of atoms? Philosopher John Lennox reiterates this point, and he says, people are using their minds to tell me that the mind is nothing but a collection of sophisticated motions of elementary particles. If the thoughts in my mind are just the atoms in my brain, a mechanism arisen by a mindless, unguided process, why should I believe anything it tells me? Atheism undercuts the scientific endeavor very seriously. It is an argument that purports to derive rationality from irrationality, which is logically incoherent. Christian theism says that the reason science is possible is because we can access the universe, at least in part, through my human intelligence, because the same God that created the universe is ultimately responsible for the human mind that I have. So my chief objection against atheism is not that it is against God, but that it is against rationality. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who is respected both by believers and non-believers, a wonderful philosopher, bear with me here, says, knowledge is warranted, justified true belief, and a belief has justification for some people if and only if that belief was formed by faculties that are functioning properly and in accordance with a good design plan in a cognitive environment and appropriate for the way those faculties were designed, and when the design plan for our faculties is aimed at obtaining truth. An engine functions properly in that it functions the way it was designed to function. Now here's where he makes his point. If knowledge presupposes justified belief, and if justified beliefs presuppose that those beliefs were formed by properly functioning faculties, and if the notion of properly functioning faculties presupposes the notion of it being designed to function a certain way, then knowledge presupposes a designer. Namely, if we want to believe anything our minds or our brains tell us, we have to first believe that there's good reason to think our brains can obtain truth, because there was a design to obtain truth, which therefore would imply that we need a design to our minds or brains to even know anything. Lastly, David Berlinski, who was not a Christian, not a believer, says in his book, The Devil's Delusion, why should a limited and finite organ, such as the human brain, have the power to see into the heart of matter, philosophy, or mathematics? These are subjects that have nothing to do with the Darwinian business of scrambling up the greasy pole of life. It is as if the liver, in addition to producing bile, were to demonstrate an unexpected ability to play the violin. In other words, why should our minds or our brains, if are simply the byproduct of evolution, why should we trust that it has the ability to think rationally and obtain truth? Lastly, even if the atheist could somehow sidestep everything I've said and answer these questions, if there is no God, what does it matter? As William Lane Craig writes in his written work, if there is no God, there is no objective or ultimate meaning, value, or purpose. Now, to be objective, it is independent of human thought. To be subjective, it depends on what people think. So no, I am not saying that an atheist can't arbitrarily make up what they deem valuable, purposeful, and meaningful. I am saying that without God, these things literally do not exist. For example, let's say we were playing a Monopoly game, and I said, you go first, do whatever you want, let me know when it's my turn. So you get all the money, place all the pieces where you want them, say your turn, I get the board and flip it over. And you say, okay, that was weird. Is it my turn? Yeah, go ahead, you can go again. Let me try this again. Get all the money, and I keep repeating the process, flipping the board over. It will eventually dawn on the other person that no matter what I do in the game, in the end, it will ultimately not matter. So let's say we cured world hunger, created peace, cured cancer. In the end, what would it matter, honestly? Objectively. Not to us right now, objectively, if even science tells us that in the end, the universe is going to just have no light, no heat, and no motion, and everything will be dead, desolate, and silent. What does it matter? Much like a Monopoly game, if there is no God, that's what life amounts to. If we want to say, well, for humans it's going to be something, we should do something for humans, that is to commit the logical fallacy of speciesism, which is kind of like racism, but against species, and that is to say you have an unjustified bias for your own species. If there is no God, what makes us different than a swarm of flies? What makes us so special? Because we can think rationally? Well, isn't that bias saying that thinking rationally is somehow gives us value, meaning, and purpose? If there is no God, there is no objective, ultimate meaning, value, and purpose. So in summation, I feel that I have demonstrated that God is necessary, at least in the cases of mere existence. For anything to exist, there has to be something that never borrowed existence to give existence to everything else. For the universe to exist, since it had a beginning and needed a cause. For evil to exist, because evil presupposes a standard of good, and good needs to have an ontology or a grounding. It presupposes objective morality, and it presupposes design. Also, God is necessary if we want to have free will, because there has to be something more to you than pure matter, physics, and chemistry, because matter, physics, and chemistry has no free will. You don't look at a rock and ask what it's doing. It has no free will. And also, for us to have a consciousness, to have a mind, to have any type of a mental life, there has to be something aside from you than your brain and body. Because rocks, physical machines, don't think, they merely react. And also, of course, to have any type of knowledge, we have to trust that our brains or minds were designed to function, to obtain truth, which would imply there would be a designer, and to have ultimate and objective meaning, value, and purpose. God is needed. So, if this is true, this brings us to the conclusion of a logically, metaphysically necessary, transcendent, self-existing, uncaused cause, unmoved mover, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, supernatural, unimaginably powerful, supremely intelligent, omnibenevolent, personal being we call God. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to respond to, in my 10 minutes that I have, to a little bit of what Pastor Evan spoke about. Much of what he said, unfortunately, though energetic, was conceptually wrong. So I'd like to start, first of all, with this notion of free will and dualism that he talked about. When we speak of dualism, specifically with a separate disembodied mind and corporal being,
the body and bodies and so on, and with the free will as well. Unfortunately, we're speaking of something that is a complete mystery to us. In fact, serendipitously, just recently I had some of my students watch a video that had a panel of philosophers and neuroscientists talking about the free will, and everyone was sort of, sorry, I meant talking about consciousness, and everyone was sort of silent about it. How is it, for example, that something that is essentially immaterial can causally interact with the material world? And we don't understand this. We don't understand causation very well in the natural world. Anyone that knows anything about the literature of causation in the physical world, especially philosophically, knows that causation is a complete mystery in the natural physical world, much less an immaterial being doing the causing. It's a very strange position to take. Certainly people do. Same thing with free will. Not entirely sure what free will is. And this isn't a cheap way out. It is a mystery. It's been referred to as an envelope with something in it. And we never open the envelope to see what's in it. And we don't open the envelope because we can't. So these are sort of weird things to rest an argument on in the first place. He spoke also of this notion of nihilism, that there is no meaning in the threat, of course, and I'm going to speak a little bit about this, so I'll keep these comments a little brief. That somehow if there's no God, or at the very least, I imagine, if there is no objective standard for our morality, then what the hell, right? Then everything goes. And I fail to find that convincing in the least. Even if there were no objective standard, there's plenty of decent thought out there that says we are these sort of meaning-creating creatures. And we see this in our daily lives all the time. In fact, walking into this church today, I mean, this is absolutely gorgeous. And it was created. And it becomes meaningful, presumably not because that meaning was given to me, which would be a counterexample, by the way, to something like free will. It's something that I can create and meaningfully look at and say, wow, this is beautiful. And I'll probably come back for the recital tomorrow, by the way. So I find these charges of nihilism, again, fairly strange, and not sure I find any support for it at all. How much time do I have? This is 20 minutes. Oh, this is my 20 minutes. Oh, I didn't realize that. All right, so let me go on then. How many minutes do I have then? I thought I had 10 minutes and then 20 minutes. Sorry. 60. Fair enough. All right. So, let me just get into this then. It is often said that without God there can be no morality, since there would be nothing to ground our moral judgment. And if there is no God, then everything is permitted. These are two very separate, very important claims. We're worried about grounding our judgment, and we're worried about people behaving badly, and rightfully so. But this phrase that without God, everything is permitted, is just a phrase. It is a highly rhetorical, emotionally charged phrase that rests on our fears of others and our sense of communion and community with our loved ones. Rather, let me focus on a more accurate phrase. Even if God does not exist, does not mean everything is permitted. Mr. Hernandez and I, Pastor Hernandez, and I agree on the main point. Morality is real, and we should be concerned about moral judgment and the correct justification of it. One side, of course, says God is that justification. The other side, of course, says God is not that justification. Let me ask you, who does not agree, or who doesn't agree that asking Jews to register as Jews is wrong? I refer, of course, to recent events the past 2 weeks in Ukraine. I forget the name of the city. It starts with a D. I actually can't pronounce that name. This wasn't official, this wasn't anything by the government, it was a radical group, of course, it was a fear tactic, but it's a reminder of what could happen if we are not morally vigilant. Who doesn't agree that the Enron scandal was the quintessential paradigm of malice, greed, and corruption, for example? Of course we agree. Now, clearly this isn't just a matter of agreement, but it's a step in the right direction. The claim is not supposed to be about a belief in God's existence. Nobody would agree that in order to be a good person, one must believe in God. Certainly not the case that just because someone believes in God's existence, that they're a good person. The claim from the religious position, and what is up for debate tonight, is that God is necessary for morality itself. But as it turns out, there are reasons why people believe that morality rests on God's existence. People believe that there is no morality without God because people believe God exists. And that's a point that we must address. If it can be shown that the arguments for God's existence are at best contentious, if not outright fallacious, then we have less and less reason to believe God exists and less reason to believe that morality rests on God's existence. I want to deal shortly with the cosmological and the teleological arguments that Pastor Hernandez mentioned. The cosmological argument for God's existence runs something like the following. If the universe came into existence, then it had a beginning. And the universe certainly did come into existence. It therefore must have had a beginning. The problem is the identification of the supposed cause of the universe with God. Set aside all of our problems of causation and understanding what the beginning actually is and so on. Set all of that aside and consider, even if the universe did have a beginning, who's to say that that beginning is the God of classical theology, the knower, the lover, the planner and organizer? The fact is that even if the universe had a beginning, making the claim that the beginning is God is an entirely different matter. That there is a supposed beginning of the universe, there's many theories on how the universe started, some of them good, some of them worse, doesn't mean that that beginning necessarily is God. We don't get to define God into existence. The teleological argument runs as follows. The things in this world, in other words, the argument from intelligent design, the things in this world we know to be complex, cars, computers, and so on, have been created by an intelligent designer, human beings. In the natural world, there are other complex things like brains and ecosystems and so on, which humans, the known creators on Earth, intelligent creators, did not create. Since complexity does not arise from non-complexity, and since complexity requires an intelligent designer, there must have been an intelligent designer, and that, of course, would be God. Set aside the fact that this argument rests on a false analogy between the universe and human artifacts. Set aside the question of whether it is really true that complexity cannot arise from non-complexity. That is a logical possibility. And consider, if the universe really was created by an intelligent designer, then again, who's to say that that designer is necessarily the God of classical theology, an omniscient, omnipotent being, and so forth? That's just another instance of assuming that there is design in the world in order to prove a designer. And that's a logical mistake. And so the line of reasoning goes for most of these types of arguments is to take observations of the world we live in, either by direct measurement or inductive experience, or both, and make some analogical regress argument back as far as is logically allowable. And then, once one has reached that end, assume that the end is God. A natural enough supposition, I suppose, but nevertheless a mistake. If, though, we are going to use the findings of science and what appears to be a concern for scientific reasoning, then we must be sure to use the findings of science properly and not extend our reasoning beyond what is reasonably allowable. And the fact is, there is no good reason to think that the Big Bang or the infinite density or whatever is posited at the beginning of the universe is anything like a transcendent and beneficent creator that we take to be by assumption. The same goes for our analogical reasoning. It is an unhappy fact of being human that we have a fairly limited experience of this world. And the experiences we do have, we take to be real. The strength of our subjective experiences have a way of persuading us that when I think something is real, it is real. And so it is no small step, or I should say it is a small step, from noticing that the complicated things that we've constructed come from intelligent beings ourselves, to making the claim that all things that are complicated require an intelligent designer. But again, this is a mistake because, one, our experiences of the world are limited. And just because it is difficult to think of complexity arising out of non-complexity does not mean that it is impossible. And two, when we do make our comparisons, we end up comparing unlike things. How exactly is the universe as a whole like anything we've experienced? In reality, we simply have nothing to compare a universe as a whole to. It is undoubtedly not like anything we've ever experienced. And so an analogy to anything we are familiar with on planet Earth, to the universe, is no analogy at all. So then, what is there to be said about morality? Do we need God to ground morality? And are we all morally impotent, animalistic beasts incapable of understanding and deriving moral norms? In the opening of his Ethics, Aristotle claims that, quote, instances of morally fine and just conduct involve so much difference and variety that they are widely believed to be such only by convention and not by nature, and that it is the mark of a trained mind never to expect more precision in the treatment of any subject than the nature of that subject allows. John Stuart Mill, in his moral work, Utilitarianism, makes a similar claim regarding the proof for the utilitarian principle. It has already been remarked, he says, that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proofs. Morality, in other words, end quote, in other words, is not an exact science, and should not expect the kind of exactness in moral theorizing that we should in a derivation of mathematical proof or logic, whereas validity has a very precise meaning. Justice and right conduct might not. And hence it would be a mistake to go looking for a rigid foundation for a fluid concept. In a debate with physicist Sean Carroll earlier this year, William Lane Craig makes use of just this type of rational principle in an answer to a question regarding Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. He ends by making a remark that Aquinas sets the bar too high for what constitutes an argument, a good argument. He continues that what we need is a valid argument and not, quote, certainty or mathematical demonstrability. What we need are valid arguments. And I think he's on to something. So here's my argument. If it can be demonstrated that the arguments for God's existence are invalid, weak, or otherwise fallacious, then there is less reason to believe that God exists. And if God's existence can legitimately be doubted, and we still perceive moral thinking, perception, and behavior, then there is less reason to believe that morality depends on God's existence. As it turns out, it can be demonstrated that the arguments for God's existence are invalid, weak, or otherwise fallacious, as I have tried to show just moments ago. We can conclude that there is less reason to believe that morality depends on God's existence. Given that the arguments for God's existence are fallacious, consider the following. Mark Bekoff, ecologist and animal behaviorist, over his long years of study, has clearly shown a fairly high degree of sophistication of moral behavior in canines. In the book Wild Justice, Bekoff and co-author Jessica Pierce make the case that morality, in broad terms, is, quote, a suite of other regarding behaviors falling into three rough clusters of cooperation, empathy, and justice. Morality is a spectrum of behaviors that share the common feature of concern for the welfare of others. There are plenty of other examples in the animal kingdom. Fruit bats assist each other in birthing, dogs have strict rules of engagement, and so on. Lawrence Colbert, on the human side, famously argued that moral development proceeds in stages, from obedience and punishment to the stage of maintaining social order, and finally to universal moral principles. Now, he was widely criticized for this, and rightfully so, and he revamped his rating system. So we were left at the highest stage of the social contract and welfare morality. And right. And my pages somehow are missing. Anyway, Morton Hunt describes the perspective of that Beckhoff is talking about, of a rational moral person considering the values and rights that ought to exist in a moral society. Action is based on maintaining the respect of the community and one's self-respect. My point has been to suggest that, as Beckhoff does, that when we are considering the term morality, we must consider strongly those arguments of our moral thinking that persist from paradigm to paradigm, and what shows up time after time, the concepts of justice, rights, and concern for others. I suspect that the reason why, from Aristotle to Mill, Colbert, and Beckhoff, and everyone in between, a span of 2,400 years, we encounter these concepts. They are central notions to any proper concept of morality. Can there be a morality without God? Unequivocally, yes. God or no God, human beings have made substantial moral progress. An ecumenical desire for the well-being of others, advances in technology, and the continued pursuit of reason and understanding of our world has led to these advances. If the arguments for the existence of God do not justify the belief in God's existence after all, then there should be no problem locating morality squarely on human reasoning and social engagement. Whether it turns out that there is any universal or fixed grounding to our moral codes is irrelevant to human moral behavior and theorizing. We'll still behave morally and immorally. Humans are good, and we can be good. We don't need God for this to be so. But what this does mean is that the burden of morality, the burden of moral responsibility, is ours and ours alone to bear. Thank you.
I'd also like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, make sure that you jot them down. Okay, and Eric, would like to do the rebuttal?
I heard Dinesh D'Souza, an apologist, once say, I feel like a mosquito at a nudist colony. I don't know where to start. You're clearing out fast enough. And I do appreciate everything you shared. I really do. I'm not trying to patronize you. That was a funny statement. One of the things he said is that to say that without God there can be no morality is just a phrase. Okay, well the phrase, to say that it's just a phrase without God there's no morality is just a phrase about the phrase without God there's no morality. That's kind of a pointless thing to say, in my opinion. There's no rebuttal there. He says without God, someone once said without God everything's permitted. He says, no, it's not true. Okay, well, who prohibits it? I didn't hear any arguments. As I said earlier, the topic is God necessary? Not why do people behave good? Or not do animals behave good? The topic was not, is there reasons we should behave good? Which of course presupposes what good is in the first place. Then he started talking about Enron and the Jews, and again the topic was God's necessity, not necessarily has there been evil done in the world. We can all clearly see that. And again, I never said, that belief in God made someone more. I think we both agree on that. But I want to clarify some terms here. And in philosophy, when we talk about morality, there's moral ontology and moral epistemology. Moral epistemology is how we come to know what morality is. Moral ontology is the grounding in which it exists. So it doesn't matter how I came to know morality. I'm not asking how do people come to know morality. I'm asking why does morality exist in the first place? And I argued in my opening statement that God's necessary for it. He talked about the Kalam, which I mentioned that's the reason that God is necessary. And he said that even if the Big Bang were true and there was a beginning to the universe, he said we have no reason to believe that it was the classical view of God. I gave a philosophical, logically deductive argument to why we do believe it is the classical God. In fact, I can reiterate it. If the universe began to exist, and the metaphysical principle that everything that begins to exist needs a cause, I can walk you through it again. If the universe is composed of space, time, and matter, and it had a beginning, then it would logically, deductively imply that whatever caused it had to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And since it made a decision to create, you don't have to call him God, call him what you want, but his attributes, spaceless, timeless, and material, would have to be a personal being since it made a decision to create, and have had to have been unimaginably powerful since it created something out of nothing. So if the principle, the metaphysical principle, that it begins, it needs a cause, and cause of what? Time, space, and matter, then it had to be outside of time, space, and matter, it had to be personal and powerful. I didn't use a teleological argument that you brought up. I didn't say that God was necessary, because we see design, therefore, if God did it. That is an argument, but I didn't use it. What I was saying is that if there is evil, then it would imply that there is a design to life, which of course would imply that there's a way things ought to function. In fact, the atheist David Hume said you can't get an ought from an is. For example, if my heart stopped beating and someone said, call a doctor, Eric's heart stopped beating, someone could easily ask, what is it? Why should I call a doctor? Are you implying that his heart ought to beat? Because we can see that it is not beating, but what in the world makes it the case that it ought to be? Well, because Eric should be alive. Well, it's another ought. Why is it an ought that human beings should be alive? Well, because he's going to die. Okay, well, again, why? In other words, I'm not asking if he should or not. I'm asking where does this notion of oughtness come from? If there is no God, it's just your opinion. In fact, now I don't know if I misheard him, but he basically said if you think it's real, it's real. I don't know if that's if he was asserting that. If he wasn't, he has more faith than I do, because again, I'm not quoting scripture using verses. I'm saying based on philosophy and logic, deductively, I presented arguments of why I think God is necessary. I think he even said that morality was not a science, said something about morality regarding science. Science doesn't touch morality. There's a lot of things that science can't touch, simply because science studies simply the materialistic world. Morality is a metaphysical thing. It's not something you can tangibly touch. Let me give you an illustration. If I were to put poison in a water bottle and give it to somebody, and I brought the top Nobel Prize winners of the world in every field of science, and I said, can you analyze what happened here? And they say, sure. The way the poison mixed with the water was such and such, and the H2O, and a chemist can tell me what happened chemically, and perhaps a nutritionist can tell me what happened in the body when the person took the poison, and perhaps a biologist could tell me other things that are happening and functioning, but not understand that not one of these scientists could look under a microscope and say, yeah, what you did was wrong, by the way. Because science doesn't touch morality. Science studies what is, not what ought to be. So science can show why my heart stopped beating, but you can't look under a microscope and say, therefore my heart should beat. It just doesn't make sense to say that morality and science, somehow science will give us an explanation for morality. I didn't hear an argument against God's necessity. In fact, the only thing I did hear that was close to there being an argument against God's necessity, he said, here's my argument, and he said, the argument I have for God not being necessary is that there are no good arguments that God is necessary. Well, that's not an argument. That's saying the reason I don't believe it is because I don't think you're right. Well, of course you don't. That's one of the debate here, is to find out who's right, not saying simply I don't believe you're right. I really didn't look for an argument. There was, again, it was just that, he said, again, talking about morality, he said, because humans act moral, well, we know God doesn't exist, and humans still act moral, therefore we don't need God for morality. This is called arguing in a circle, to say that since we know God doesn't exist, and there still is morality, then apparently we don't need God for morality. That's, of course, on the assumption that there is no God, and that morality still exists. Talked about that there is moral progress in the world, that we have learned to be better, and that we through our moral reasoning, through our reasoning, we've made progress. What the problem with this assertion is that he's using a moral statement to affirm that morality exists. It's a tautology, really. It's like saying the reason we should be good is because it's good to be good. Okay. That doesn't give me a reason why I should be good. That simply tells me that being good is good. We should be good because it helps humans flourish and technology is good for us. Okay, you're giving me a moral reason of why I should be moral, which is a circular argument. I'm not asking why we should be moral. I'm asking, does morality even exist in the first place? He even said, in fact, these issues of justice and rights, they keep showing up in history. Well, I agree. That's why the argument says that if morality exists, or rather the argument I presented said if morality does not exist, or if God does not exist, morality doesn't exist. Well, morality does exist, therefore God exists. So he actually is affirming the argument I'm saying, that because there is morality, we need a grounding for it, and that grounding can't be in humans, because let's go back so many years, and let's look at the reasoning of human beings. Segregation, eugenics movement, where they sought to kill off the mentally handicapped, homosexual, the elderly, people that were useless. Their reasoning was justified to them. If there's no God, how is there objective morality? Imagine this for a second. Imagine an alien race came and abducted us and used us as farm equipment, perhaps even probed us, raped us, whatever, and we said, you can't do this to us. And all they would have to say is, why? You're just cattle to me. That may be your morality. That's not the way we evolved. That may be your reasoning, but we're far more advanced than you. We're far more intelligent, so our morality and our reasoning has showed us that there is no morality, or perhaps our morality is better than yours. In other words, who's to say what is right or wrong? And if he's going to say, well, it helps humans flourish, again, you're saying we should be good because it is good, which is, again, a circular argument. I heard no argument to why God is not necessary. I argued for God is necessary because for anything to exist, for the universe to have a beginning, for us to have free will, consciousness, morality, to even trust what our minds are telling us we needed God to be there, to exist, to trust that we can trust our own beliefs and thoughts. In summation, again, I heard no argument. Perhaps I misunderstood him, but of course, I'll be giving a rebuttal to what I said, and I'm more than welcome to hear what he has to say. But I think in conclusion, we have heard arguments for why God is necessary, and have not heard any arguments for why he isn't. Thank you.
All right, now that I have my 10 minutes. So lots to sort of respond to. The question is whether God is necessary for morality. It's not up to me to argue that God doesn't exist or that God isn't necessary. God's existence isn't necessary. It's not the question at all, and so of course I'm not going to present an argument against that or for the non-necessity of God. We can do that, but that doesn't seem to be relevant to the specific topic here. Is God necessary for morality? And no, is of course the answer. And Pastor Eric Hernandez is correct in saying that's why we're here. But notice this line of reasoning. So it's been charged that I have been engaging in some sort of circular question-begging type of argument. But notice this line of reasoning, right? If we want to say something like, there can be no morality without God, and then we use morality to prove that God exists, then how is that not itself circular? So even if even if there were some argument that demonstrated that let's say, God necessarily existed, that is a wholly different argument from saying what characteristics God would have to have, and that includes whether morality is a necessary part of God's existence. And that, tonight, has also not been shown. But that is an argument that itself needs to be shown. So, that's why I didn't present an argument for God not necessarily existing. What I tried to show, what my strategy was simply that the arguments for God's existence are fairly easily deflatable. And so if there's less reason to believe, then there's more reason to think that morality comes from, at least in our case, human beings. It's sort of weird to think that there must be some fixed position. The argument that Pastor Hernandez put forward about how God necessarily has to exist, he said that God will be a spaceless, timeless, and personal, or a person. So even if in the cosmological arguments, and there's many versions of the argument, that you do identify a singular point, saying that God would have to be spaceless, timeless, and personal, also, on Pastor Hernandez's account, was not argued for. It was just stipulated. But it needs an argument. So, you can argue that there might have to be some necessary being. Of course, I won't buy those arguments for a second, for much of the reasons that I discussed. But even if you could do that, you have to argue and present a reason why that thing would have to be spaceless, timeless, and so on. And again, heard no argument for that either. And I'll add in there too that morality would have to come from God as well. Again, no argument on that one. And finally, the idea that the metaphysical principle that everything that exists needs a cause, as I mentioned earlier. Not only is that not necessarily true, that comes from our experience of the world and our human reasoning. And this was part of my point in my talk. That the way we understand causation is inside a world of seeming causation and time. And then we extrapolate backwards, weirdly enough, and arrive at some point that's mysterious and say, well, it had to have a cause. Says our experience and our experience alone. But we have nothing and that's from within the universe. We have nothing to make the comparison from the outside of the universe when presumably time and causation did not happen. That's a mistake on our part. And so the claim about the animals and Jews and so on, where does morality rest? With us. I did offer an answer for that. So, if the arguments for God's existence can be shown to be fallacious, and we can still somehow meaningfully talk about morality, then if that's what we have with our limited experience, then that's what we have. It beats making a whole bunch of errors in the opposite direction. And with that, I will concede my time.
Is the wireless on? Is it working? Testing 1, 2, 3.
Flores.
Can you hear me?
This way.
Can you hear me? Is it mic?
Yeah. Okay, we're going to start the private conversation right now. And like I said, I'll try to see if you can jot down your questions, and then the ushers will come and pick them up. Gentlemen, I both thought that you did a great job, made a lot of points. Then there were some concepts that I just wanted for you to expand on. Eric, first, you mentioned the concept of speciesism, and I didn't quite catch that all. And also, I think that for many of the people in the audience, I think that's part of the person that they've heard of that term. Can you just clarify that a little bit more?
All right. Speciesism would be a fallacy that you pretty much deem human beings, the human species, more valuable than any other species. And my point to that was that there's no God, that it's just your opinion. As Professor said that his reason for morality was that it's grounded in humans, well then I guess he would admit that it is subjective, because imagine this for a second. If no human existed, would it still be wrong to torture a child for fun? And does it depend on a human mind to think that for that to be true? So to be a speciesist, to commit the fallacy of speciesism, it is to say that humans are more valuable than any other species, but what reason do you have for believing that? That would be the clarification for species.
Thank you. And Dan, did you want to respond to something Eric said, or do you want me to ask the...
Sure. So speciesism would work in any direction, no matter what species. And so, two sort of comments briefly. Some of our moral philosophers, like Jeremy Bentham in particular, argued on the basis of pain and pleasure, which would be an objective fact about pretty much any sentient being, and based his morality on that. And so not necessarily subjective. That would be about as objective as it would get in terms of our experience. And then two, we can philosophers such as Kant and so on rely on pure reason and rationality and the notion of contradiction in order to ground morality. And if you don't like the pain and pleasure stuff, then certainly there's logical reason to think that there would be objective fact based on reason. So plenty of examples.
Sure. A few points. Pain and pleasure according to who? I'd say we have some people that enjoy pain and don't like pleasure, or perhaps the opposite, or perhaps what's painful for one person isn't painful for another, or what's pleasurable for one person isn't pleasurable for another. So again, the point is, if you're asking a human being, what do you think is painful or pleasurable, then there's, that's subjective, because it's dependent on them. And I find it funny that, interesting that earlier you said that the metaphysical principle that everything that begins to exist has a cause, we only think that because it's our human reasoning that tells us, aside from the fact that your human reasoning tells you that it's just human reasoning that tells you that, so we shouldn't believe it. Are you not using human reasoning, the very thing that you said isn't valid enough to trust something, that there is objective morality? So how can you in one breath say human reasoning isn't sufficient to believe or trust a principle, but then in the next breath say that it's sufficient to trust that we have objective morality?
I think anyone who knows me, and certainly my students who've taken my classes, know that I argue for a position of uncertainty. That I think being uncertain epistemically, not to mention psychologically or ontologically, is a valuable place. We assume way too much in our ontologies, period. Is human reasoning faulty? Of course it is. Absolutely. And even our best reasoning goes wrong. This happens in science and philosophy and geology and our biology classes and churches and in political things. So human reasoning isn't the end-all sort of be-all. It is incredibly limited, and that's part of it. That's part of my message that I'm trying to say. So I have more commitments to human reasoning being it, but it is what we have. We have human reasoning, and right now, that's the tool we have to use. Let's just accept its limits.
Do you trust your reasoning?
To an extent. Certainly, to an extent. I mean, yeah, sure. I think we all trust our reasoning to an extent, but I have yet to meet anyone who thinks they're infallible. I mean, certainly I don't think that's what we're claiming.
Well, no, not at all, but I'm saying there are some... It seems you're asserting a strong skepticism, which is, well, I don't know, therefore neither can you, or we don't know, and we shouldn't claim we can, although claiming that we can't know something is something you know. I think just to say that there is not 100% certainty isn't a valid reason to not believe something. Earlier you talked about something being possible, logically possible. Not to be facetious by any means, but it is logically possible that a car would fall through the roof of this building on my head. There is nothing logically impossible about that, but to say something is logically possible doesn't mean it will happen. in order to believe something, as I'm sure you're familiar with epistemology, you have to at least have enough reasons to believe it, and to believe that it's more plausibly true than not true. For example, even though it's possible that a car is going to fall on my head in 5 minutes, I have more reasons to not believe it than I have to believe it, so I'm justified in believing what I do, even if I'm not 100% certain.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that that's part of our mistaken reasons. We can justify just about anything. I mean, that's just all there is to it. But just because we can justify it doesn't mean that that's necessary reason to believe it. We have to be careful about how we justify it. And of course, the justified true belief model of epistemology has been fairly clearly demonstrated that that's a lot weaker than what we think it is. So, famous paper, 1963, Edwin Gettier writes this paper. It's a page and a half long, showing why that's a mistake.
So he uses a justification to why justification is wrong.
Yeah, of course, but it's a justification in the right area. It's not just any justification. So, and Gettier realizes, alive and well, by the way, that reasoning has its limits. Yeah, a certain type of skepticism. It keeps us from making claims that ultimately don't have much of a justification. So, for example, the beginning of the universe, justification to believe it? In one sense, yeah. Not every physicist who works on this thinks there is a beginning. There's a sense in which that doesn't make any sense that there's a beginning. The universe could be infinite, for example, in which case talking about a beginning is pointless. But to make the step to say that beginning is a personal being, again, it seems to be a mistake. How? I have nothing to compare it to.
Well, I didn't attribute that the beginning was a personal being instead of the cause. And I don't see any to the circle.
Said the cause was a personal being.
Right, not a beginning into the cause. He wasn't the beginning, he was the cause to the beginning. And I use a logical argument for that. But again, it seems that you're saying if you can't know something for certain, you shouldn't trust it. And then of course, no. Okay. Can you clarify that?
I'm just saying we should, if we can't know anything for certain, doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily trust it. I don't know for certain lots of things. I don't know for certain that my mom loves me, for example. But
Right.
I have the behavior to go on. But I have good enough reason to think that. But if you press me, right, then I have to say I don't know. So a limited type of skepticism, not as strong as you might think, but it doesn't mean we can't do anything in the world. It certainly doesn't mean we can't hold people responsible.
Do you believe we can have knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's certainly limited. I don't think it's as certain as we like to think it is. And I think arguments for, say, God's existence and morality prove the point that our reasoning is nowhere near as certain as we think it is.
And do you believe in absolute truth?
Meaning what exactly?
Something that is certainly true without doubt.
It seems like in our world, I want to say something like that. I don't like the term absolute necessarily. I think the way we understand things, for instance, validity in an argument, I think that's going to be true, right? So that's going to be true. So
do you believe you can know anything absolutely?
Again, in a strong sense, I don't. It's weird to talk about absolutes. I don't know exactly, right? Like across worlds, possible worlds, and so on. I think it's weird. Yeah, I've never. A limited form of skepticism. But look, validity, say for example, follows is a logical concept, and we have good reason to think that when we do a math proof, for example, that's how it works. In that kind of absolute truth, yes. But when we start saying absolute truth, that say some being has to exist necessarily, no, because a lot of that's based on our experience.
So just to clarify, you do believe that there are things we can know for certain, without doubt?
We could be wrong about our mathematical proofs, yeah. So in that strong sense that you're talking about, no, but in the limited sense of our experience, sure.
So we can't be certain about, there's nothing we can be certain about, and you're certain.
Yeah, it's a classic, yeah, very classic, very classic. So, sort of a high school sort of move, right?
But certainly,
so
it's a self-defeating statement to say that. I don't see how you can say that with certainty.
Right. So look, this sort of a classic thing. So Socrates, Descartes say, if the only thing I can be certain is certain. We take oftentimes this notion of circularity, for example, to be more than what it is. The universe very well might be infinite, and if that's the case, right, there's going to be no necessary way to know. But that would be the way things are. What I'm advocating is that our reason isn't as precise as we often think it is. So I'm going to claim certainty of certain things in this world, right? But as far as we actually know, we could be wrong. That's all I'm saying, and that's the limit of what I'm saying, is that it is possible to be wrong.
But do you think you could possibly be wrong about the possibility that I'm wrong?
Look, if that's the way things are, and it ends up in this circle, then we're both participating.
Not at all.
And so I have yet to see. So let me ask you, how do you argue that there in fact is certainty and be 100% absolutely right without in fact question begging, assuming truth and falsehood?
Well, because to assume otherwise would be a self-defeating statement. To say that there is no truth would be a statement of truth, and therefore a defeating statement about truth. So clearly it's not is there truth, but how can we obtain truth and where is it at?
Sure.
So I can say that was certainty.
Okay, so that's a logical certainty. That's fine. I agree to that. I agree to that. Now, if that's true, then how do we go from those type of statements of, say, logical certainty, purely logical certainty,
Right.
So to deny a truth claim would be itself a truth claim. I'm on board with that completely.
Okay.
But how do we go from that to all these other certainties and so on?
Right. Well, for those in the audience that aren't familiar with epistemology, like I said in the beginning, to know something you have to have a justification without defeaters, which is, like I said, a justification. And which is also why I argue if there's no God, you have defeaters to believe and know anything because you can't trust your very brain or mind that's thinking. So my justification to say that I at least have good reasons to believe something, even if there are some doubts, you don't have to have no doubt to know something. You can, for example, if I have an apple and someone has a better apple than mine, it doesn't mean I don't have an apple. So I can know something without being 100% certain that I know it and still claim to have knowledge about it.
Sure, and on logical grounds, that's fine. But let's keep it on sort of logical grounds. When we start going from the logic to validity and so on to making claims about what exists and what doesn't, we're going into existential ground here. And so I just find it weird that, yeah, sure, logical truths all day long, absolutely. But how do you go from that to a being that necessarily has to exist? Because that's the question then.
Right. Well,
you define something as necessary. Very quick. You define something as necessary, and then say it must be true.
You're a philosopher, you know that we use philosophy in arguments. So, using the argument of, I didn't simply say that, because the universe exists, therefore God exists. I gave a logically deductive argument that using what we know about the universe, not what we don't know, that it began time, space, and matter, and something timeless, spaceless, and immaterial would need to cause it. And if you want to talk about the universe being eternal, I can give you a justification and a reason that you can't cross infinity and that an actual infinite can't exist. So a past series of infinite events is logically impossible. So we can be logically certain that it's not, that the universe was not infinite. We could show through science the principles of science like entropy and second law of thermodynamics that the universe is using up its usable energy and it's disappearing, so it couldn't have been infinitely old because it would have used up all its gas by now. Just like filling up a car, it can't infinitely run forever, it's going to eventually run out of gas. So sure, I could be knowledgeable about these things and give justification.
And for each of those claims, there's a counterclaim too. Not everyone thinks it's not logically impossible for an infinity. Logically impossible. We confuse. No, it's not. So, for example, the number line, mathematically, yes. So we both agree to it. We both agree to it. So logically, so take the number line. The number line's infinite, and not only are there infinities, there's hierarchies of infinities. For example, this is what drove Georg Cantor, for example, insane by thinking about this stuff. So logically, yes, no problem. We both agree there. But it's the claim that when we start talking about the especially physical aspects of the universe that I find so strange. Infinities are logical. And in science, there's reason to believe that the universe might be infinite. especially with something like the multiverse theory, which is a viable theory.
Well, even then, the
Or even like multiverse.
and there's been
A
a
theory anyway.
Right.
So I mean, we can go back and forth. It has not been established that the Big Bang is,
Right.
for example, is it. There could be lots and lots of other Big Bangs. In fact, 10 to the 100 black holes that have infinite densities in them very well could be portals to another universe. That is a viable live theory right now. So if we're going to talk about logic, let's
Right.
talk about logic. That's fine, but let's not mix our logical concepts with our experience of the world. It's weird to think that the physical world we live in is infinite, but that's not our experience, so we can't speak much against it.
But it seems you're kind of special pleading here. You can say it's mysterious to think the universe is infinite, but when I talk about God, and if I were to say he's mysterious, you could say, well, no, that's just logically incoherent.
I don't recall ever saying
No, I didn't say you did.
Right. Is a concept of God, right? So one question we have is how do we know exactly, say, what omniscience and omnibenevolence and omnipotence are and so on?
Right.
Which is part of my point, is we have nothing to compare that to. And even if, in our best reasoning, we are not committing logical fallacies, for example, we still have nothing to compare it to. So in what sense do we know what omniscience is, for example?
Right. Well,
Is there anyone to answer?
Well, I can answer that, but that'd be another topic of theology, and it's not the topic of tonight. But you're basically asserting that if there's counter arguments to anything that we can't trust it. But everything you said could be counterly argued, and you trust that.
No, again, as I said, we can trust things. Our reasoning takes us far. We get space shuttles off the ground, we cure diseases and so on. That's a high degree of trust. Trust our friends and so on. But trust isn't an absolute.
Right.
Trust gets betrayed, and so we can't use that as any sort of appeal to anything.
And you trust that.
Yeah, I mean, we can do this all day long.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Just because we have reason to doubt is all I'm saying. I'm really not trying to be facetious. I promise.
All right, I believe you.
I'm trying to. You're saying that because we can doubt something, we shouldn't say with absolute certainty, which I agree, but you say that with certainty, and then you say, well, you could be wrong, but when I talk about God, it seems that you're certain he doesn't exist, and it's as if, so he could exist.
The concept of God and what we say about what God exists, I'm not sure we have a coherent concept of God.
I give you a definition.
Yeah, you give a definition, a classical definition, but whether we're correct about what that means is, again, sort of an assumption.
I could make up a definition right here and there. I mean, we're arguing this definition I brought up today. So
right, I'm not sure it's coherent. Like, I don't know what omniscience is. I can define it like all knowing, right?
That's not an attribute I mentioned today.
Yeah, you do. It's on the slide.
Omniscience.
Omnipotent.
Omnipotent.
Okay, fine. Omnipotent. What does it mean to be omnipotent, right? Even theologians differ on this, right? Theology will say, on the one hand, God can do anything, like Descartes, for example, including break the laws of logic and mathematics, whereas someone like Thomas...
Yeah, I can show that that's not true.
Well, the point is that people do argue for that. Aquinas says that that's impossible, that there are things that no being can do, for example. And so, yeah, in terms of the history, we don't have a coherent notion of omniscience and omnipotence and so on.
Well, truth is not based on consensus.
Of course not.
Okay,
But it
so
does
what does it
demonstrate
matter that people don't know?
It demonstrates our uncertainty.
And that people are wrong. For example, hypothetically speaking, someone could give arguments for atheism, and I could show that they're wrong because that means atheism is true. And you didn't answer my question whether or not you think God exists.
Yeah, I have no idea if God exists. I don't think anyone does. I think people are psychologically certain, and I think certainly people are convinced God exists. But if we're talking about sort of this, we keep mentioning epistemology, right? We sort of talk about like actual. I think you mentioned ontological knowledge or something like that. I don't remember. Well, whatever. So the big sort of truth out there. I'm just not sure how that's sort of coherent. We come from a very limited experience. One of my favorite replies to this is, look, it's John Locke, right? So against the sort of skeptical position, right? The strong skepticism. You don't know that the water in front of you or the ham sandwich that you're going to eat isn't poisoned, right? And every measurement that we have to test it could be falsified because the machine could be broken or whatever, right? But if the skeptic holds to that kind of skepticism, then you can meet a fairly quick death. So, no, I trust my friends, certain friends more than others, certain family members more than others. I trust my reason to an extent. And this was my point in the paper. We not only get by, but we make definite moral progress that is directly attributed to our human reasoning. I don't see how to get more certain than that.
Well, but we can be wrong about it, because there's counter arguments to the morality that we suggest versus what was in the past, possible the future. So how can you call it moral progress?
To use your language, because it's the best we have, and we're justified in doing it because our experience tells us, right? The justification is that we see it, we do it, and we have moral precepts now that are morally better than others. Now, if you don't like the fact that morality comes from human reasoning, then that's another topic of another debate. But it is demonstrable that things are better now. If you're a woman, for example, it's better to probably live now than, say, 200 years ago. Right? Women in the United States have had the right to vote for less than 100 years. And if that's not morally better, then
on whose human reasoning? I mean, are we going to ask Hitler's human reasoning? Are we going to ask, our president's human reasoning? Mine, yours? I mean, whose human reasoning are we going to trust?
Right, sure. So I think there's many ways to go here. I mentioned two. Kant and Bentham, for example.
And why they're...
We do. It's an arbitrary... I pick lots of others. But look, we do reason, most of us. We do feel pleasure and pain, most of us. And if that's true, that's an objective fact about this world. And both of these lines of reasoning and morality are rested on those objective facts. Now, if we're looking for some bigger thing, I have yet to see any sort of convincing argument for that, because all those things are based on are elements of the natural world and human reason.
But, okay, you say there's objective... You believe in objective morality. I'm just trying to clarify.
I think things are real, yeah. I think objective in the sense that you've been talking about some things are larger and
It's
smaller.
not dependent on human opinion. Do you think that there is something right or wrong independent of what we may think?
I tend to, yeah. So, for example, slavery, right? Slavery is wrong. But even if that's objective, it's still addressed in reasoning. Maybe not human reasoning, maybe some other reasoning.
I agree with that.
And if there were no humans, for example, let's assume just humans are it for right now. Let's say there's no intelligent creature, then in that sense, no, I don't think there would be an objective morality. But you get human reasoning, and yeah, you get as objective as it gets. I see nothing wrong.
Just in the interest of time, here's a question. It's a very classical question that's posed to intro to philosophy students, and it's called the Euthyphro quandary. And Euthyphro is the name of a dialogue written by Plato, and he uses Socrates. Socrates as the main character, and Socrates' character being Euthyphro. So my question to you is, if you were to choose a Euthyphro, how would you respond to Socrates' question? Essentially what Socrates asks is that, let's say, is murder wrong, for example? Is it wrong because God said so? Or is it wrong because of an independent reason outside of God? And so it's kind of like he was almost like trying to trap Euthyphro. And so I'm kind of curious as to how to view, if you were in his shoes, how would you respond to Socrates?
Yeah, right. So if you read the Euthyphro, it's a great moment in the dialogue. It's the sort of focal point of the dialogue, it seems. One of the initial reactions, so Euthyphro is the religious go-to guy. He's the sort of know-it-all of all things religious. He's the seer, and so on. And he gets into this argument with Socrates, and Socrates asks him, does God love something because it's good, or is it good because God loves it? And it seems as if he's being trapped. And this is a genuine reaction. But if you read the rest of the dialogues and you see what Socrates is up to, then it seems as if Socrates is incredibly serious. It's not necessarily a trap. After all, Euthyphro is the guy who's making the claim. He knows what piety is. And all Socrates does is say, how do you know? Show me. And in each case, he fails to do so. And that's just how the dialogue goes. I don't think Socrates is being facetious at all. I don't think he's playing around. I think he's very serious. He ends up dying in the end because of what he believes in. If you want to address the actual sort of meaning of what he says, that's fine. But Socrates is dead serious.
And what he basically said, like was said, was, why is something good? Because God said it, or did God say it because it is good? As if God himself abides by a standard of good outside of him. I would say it's a false dichotomy, it's a false dilemma. If I asked you, have you stopped beating your wife? If you said yes, that means you were at one point. If you say no, that means you're still on. So it's a false dilemma because it's neither one of those, but rather that God is himself the standard of good. It would be like asking, is water wet because of the wetness, or is wetness wet because of the water? They're mutually exclusive. It's not as if God makes up the good, nor that he abides by a standard of good, but literally that he is the good. But again, I'd like to point out that if there is no God, earlier it seemed that he was, again, I'm not trying to characterize what he's saying, I'm honestly trying to clarify it, that he said that because there's counter-arguments to a belief, then we can't be certain about it because some people disagree. But then he said that truth wasn't a consensus thing that everybody should agree on. But I quoted two atheists, one a scientist, one a well-respected philosopher, who said there is no morality, and it's just an adaptation, and we make it up, and it's like your hands and feet. It's just something that helps you survive. That was the atheist philosopher Michael Roos. So he's saying we can trust that morality exists, but then there's a counter-argument by an atheist philosopher who says there is no morality. So I would think, once again, that if morality exists, it has to be transcendent, not coming from us. We can perceive morality, something that is right or wrong, but we don't make it up. If you discover something, you don't invent it. And if you don't invent it, that means it was there before you and will probably be there after you. And if morality isn't dependent on people, then where does it come from if not mainly God?
To respond to that, look, so you can call it a false dichotomy, right? So you don't want God to be the follower, certainly. And if God sets the standard of what's good or bad, which is usually what's said, by the way, then it's completely arbitrary because God can make whatever is good and whatever is bad. So given God's power, but if we want to say, God is good, okay, fine. But again, that's precisely what needs to be shown is A, that there's a God, and two, that God is necessarily good. And that's what has been failed to be shown. That's what's failed to be shown.
Based on a moral experience, just like you said earlier, it could be. I'm sure you're familiar with the position of philosophy called solipsism, the view that only I exist and everybody's a figment of my imagination. That's logically possible. I can't logically prove that it's not the case, that everybody is just a figment of my imagination and I'm the only thing that exists. But do I have any reason to believe it? Well, of course not. So I'm not saying what's logically possible, or that God, I'm not sure what you were saying earlier about logical possibility, but the fact that we have an experience of reality would be a justification that the external world exists, and the fact that we have an experience of morality, and we feel some things really are right or wrong, would show that morality exists, and if it exists, again, I reiterate, it has to have a grounding outside of us.
This is one of my points, is we feel things very strongly all the time, and mistake, oftentimes.
But it's not a good reason to believe it.
Sure, but it doesn't mean we're right either.
Right.
And so look, I feel sort of very strongly, right? I think you're right. There's no reason to think I'm the only one that exists. There seems to be some experience of morality, but that's not the point. Is that we do experience this, and there's no reason to think that it's not grounded in the natural world. So, for example, if we want to go beyond the natural world, I made this point earlier, that notice in the arguments for a supernatural being, all rest either on merely logical possibilities or premises that are proved only within and through the natural world. And how you conclude the supernatural from the natural is a mystery beyond me.
Well, I give an argument for why we think something timeless, spaceless, and material exists. And morality isn't something that comes from the natural. I mean, you can't touch morality. You can't touch a thought. You can't touch the number two.
Reasoning is part of nature. We're here, we're reasoning. How about part of nature?
But if we're just, like I argued earlier in my opening, if we're just pure physics, matter, and chemistry, physics, matter, and chemistry doesn't reason. Do you believe we have free will?
Free will's weird. I mentioned that was a mystery. Nobody
sort of understands free will. We laugh and feel very strong and so on, but there's really good evidence to suggest that free will is some sort of delusion. But here's the point, even if it is, it's not going to stop us from making moral decisions and hold people responsible for that. It's simply a mistake. But I might mention, you mentioned and said something about this sort of dualism about mind and body. Even if that's true, which of course don't necessarily believe that for a second, but even if that's true, right, mind would still be natural. Mind would still be well within the natural realm. And just because it seems weird to say that doesn't mean that that's not true. That's just relying on our experience.
You keep saying things are weird. That's somehow a fear for something.
I love the fear.
So if you think that we have reason to believe that free will is an illusion, so I'm assuming you lean to the side that we don't have free will, yet you take intellectual responsibility for believing we don't have free will, but if we don't have free will, how can you say that you freely chose to believe that, and how can you hold me accountable for not believing that we don't have free will if there is no free will, it's just an illusion?
That's classic. Look, imagine a case where we don't have free will. It would look exactly like the world we live in right now, and you wouldn't be able to tell. So if you follow the arguments for determinism and theological determinism and so on, you can say God's foreknowledge, then it can very easily be shown that you couldn't tell the difference. And in that world, I'm still going to blame people. I'm still going to praise them.
But you were determined to. You didn't have free will.
But we couldn't tell the difference. Is the point? You wouldn't know.
Well, you're determined to believe that if you don't have free will.
Huh?
If you don't have free will, you're determined to believe it.
Sure. but we wouldn't know. I mean, that's the point. We wouldn't know.
Well, guys, I'll tell you what. Why don't we open the floor out to questions? Then, awesome.
Oh, sure. Okay. Sure. So this comes from, if you don't mind me saying your name, this comes from Victoria. Are there universal truths, or is morality subjective to individuals and or societies? So, if you take a class with me, and I start the whole thing by talking about logical truth and falsity. And so, for example, and this was mentioned a moment ago, that you say things like contradictions are always false. In that sense, yes, sure. Those truths would seemingly exist whether or not there was any rational being. There might not be anybody to know it. So in that sense, yeah, universal truths. Do I believe that there are certain truths that arise from our human social engagement? Absolutely. Step outside your door and you're going to see that. I'm going to be one way right now, say hungry. It happens to be that's true. A little while later, I'm not going to be hungry, and that's also going to be true. So those sorts of truths change also. So in that sense, yes, universal truth.
I'd just rather read one of the questions here. Actually, what we were just talking about. The question is, if God is all-knowing, how do you explain free will, since God has already determined our future? The question presupposes that God has determined our future. I'm not a Calvinist, nor am I an atheistic Calvinist, which is determinist. So I don't believe that we are determined. I believe that, yes, God knows our future, but He doesn't cause our future. If I know that tomorrow the sun's going to rise, I clearly didn't cause it. And this would be a theological position that I espouse to, called Molinism, which is that God knows every contingent possible outcome of your life and knows you so well that He knows what route you're going to take. But Him knowing clearly doesn't make you do it. So because God knows our future doesn't mean He determines our future. Again, I encourage you to look up Molinism. But for example, if I were, and there's various ways of explaining God's foreknowledge, which again would be another deeper topic, but because God knows something, think of it, William Lane Craig says, think of it as an infallible barometer. A barometer measures a temperature because of what the temperature is. The barometer doesn't make the temperature that way. The barometer knows the temperature because of what it reads, or what, rather than not saying that God perceives but rather that just like the barometer knows the temperature, because what the temperature is, God knows the future because of He knows what's going on. That's part of being omniscient. So because God knows the future, it by no means follows that He is determined.
So someone got 2 in here. Lots of great questions. Let me, something to do with it. So, all scientific disciplines, so if you don't mind me saying the name, this is Eli Olivares. All scientific disciplines agree to scientific constants and laws within an isolated system of the universe. How do you justify that these laws are constant? Where were there before our discovery of them, and how did they arise without a designer? I don't know if I can get to every single part of this question, but look, one of the points here in this sort of business about epistemology is certainty. And yes, there's a lot we agree on, so scientifically, there's a lot we agree on theologically. So no doubt about the agreement there. But one of the important points of science is that the things that we do claim are always falsifiable. Now, in a good theory, a good hypothesis, a good premise in science, there's going to be less and less reasons to think it's not true. And so that would presumably be our justification to go ahead and believe it, but always with the notion that it could be falsified. One of my favorite definitions, for example, of the word fact comes from Stephen Jay Gould, who says, fact in science can only mean verified to such a degree that to deny it would be an absurdity, or to deny provisionalist it would be an absurdity. I think it's accurate. We have a high degree of reasons for believing in things. But the moment we say things are absolutely this way and we could never be wrong, then that would be the type of knowledge that we would grant to some omniscient being. Unless we're talking about, say, purely logical truths. And so on. As far as the constants and discovering them and so on. Constants are discovered in large part mathematically, logically, and so on, fueled by things we see in the universe. You sit down in a bathtub, the water rises, and you ask why, and if you're Newton, you discover create a calculus that explains that. So, code, inventor of calculus, I might add.
Thank you.
Again, a lot of good questions here, too. Here's one. It says, if God is the ground of your morality and He ordered you to kill your son, would you? Well, I don't have a son, so next question. I'm assuming they're alluding to Abraham being commanded to kill Isaac. I would first say that God would never, it would be a logical contradiction for God to command something immoral. For example, to give more weight to it, if someone were to ask me, could God create a rock so big He couldn't lift, I would say no, because that's a logical contradiction. Omnipotence does not mean to do the logically impossible, because it's not even a possible thing God could do. It's not as if God, if He just had to lift a little bit more weights, and then He could, create a square circle or a married bachelor or a rock so big He couldn't lift. So these are things that are impossible, not even possible things to be actualized in reality. So God cannot command something immoral, and it would, the action in itself sometimes might not be immoral. For example, if I asked everybody here, who here raise your hand if you would stab a baby with a metal object? I don't think anybody would. Well, a few. We'll pray for you later. But then if I said, now who here would stab a baby with a metal object called a syringe filled with a vaccine, much more people would raise their hand, because the action in itself doesn't simply determine the morality behind it, it's the motive and the reason. So if God were to command something, and if He is a standard of moral good and objective morality, then He would command would be necessarily moral, and it would be impossible for Him to command something immoral.
I would also agree that the motive and the reason has everything to do with why the action is immoral.
Right.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mean to.
Okay.
I actually we agree. Never be too sure. This is a great question. I love this. This comes from C. If I'm reading that right, C.I.
Can you examine the outside evidence? I think that says containing, I'll work through it, containing God's existence and necessity of his existence without personal bias against his existence. I'm assuming what you're asking is, can we prove God's existence without our own sort of personal assumptions and so on? I can extend that to sort of lots of things, just not just God. I think that's a very nice question. It is difficult to make our judgments, even about rationality, without getting personally involved in it. Even the very notion of talking about truth or falsity, forget the religious, the psychological, and so on, it becomes very difficult not to answer questions and not bring into it some sort of bias. Is it possible? It's logically possible, yes. Is it metaphysically possible? I suppose so. But is it psychologically possible? I don't know. I'm going to err on the side and say we ought to be very careful about our claims. Very difficult thing to overcome.
Okay. There's another one that I liked. They're all good. This one says, how do you reconcile a benevolent, which is all good, omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful being with the notion of eternal hell and all the grief in this world? Good question. Well, notice in the beginning, I had said that, first of all, if evil exists, we have to assume that God exists, because evil assumes a deviation from good, and good would need an ontology such as God. But I like how the question is worded. It's worded very carefully. How do you reconcile if these two things exist? I like what I believe it was C.S. Lewis. Let's talk about hell for a second. Some believers erroneously think that God one day is going to destroy evil, and I disagree not just with atheists, but with some unbelievers too. So don't take it personally, anyone. But the Bible doesn't teach that God's going to destroy evil. It teaches He's going to quarantine it. Because to destroy evil would be a logical impossibility. How do I destroy hunger? If hunger is a lack of food in my stomach, I can't destroy it, but rather I put in what it's lacking. So if something is evil, I can't destroy it, or rather I have to add good. But if someone freely chooses to do evil, God can't make him do good, because to be free, you can't be forced to do something. So that would be a logical contradiction for God to destroy evil by taking away people's freedom and telling them to freely act moral. C.S. Lewis also nicely said that if someone wants to live without God, then in the end, what would be more justified than to give that person what he wants, including total separation from God, which is what the Bible teaches what hell is. Now, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If good comes from God, peace, joy, happiness, you can't say, I want nothing to do with God, but still reap the benefits of what God has to give. So, no God, meaning none of that either. You either have God with that, or you say, I don't want any of it, and you got to take as it is. I can't leave America and claim the rights of an American in a communist country, because I have left where those rights come from. So if these things come from God, I can't say I want to be separated from God and still expect to have all the nice things that comes in life and pleasures and whatnot. So again, it's not hard to reconcile at all. Grief in the world where we have free creatures who do evil things. You can't destroy evil because it's a lack of good, and you can't make someone do good if they are to be free, moral creatures. And hell is an eternal separation from God. And as C.S. Lewis said, what would be more fair than to give people what they want?
My last question here, I guess, is, so Crystal Hernandez writes, you said humans are good. Quote, where do you get your definition of good? Are you saying humans are all good? What happens to the evil ones? In a theological context, what happens to the good and the bad? No idea. I'm not sure that's a coherent set of ideas. What happens to them here? Lots of things, right? Some of them, the evil ones, some of them never get discovered. Some of them get discovered and get off for various reasons. Some get punished. Same thing with the good. Bad things happen to the good all the time, and so on and so on. So that's, in that sense, that's fairly easy. The difficult part is the sort of definition of good. So indeed, humans are good, and I followed that by saying, and we have the capacity to do good, which I suppose suppose suggests that we don't always do good, or we might do evil. Evil doesn't, using the terms good and evil, doesn't assume a theological position. Maybe saying something is evil, that might assume that there's some good. That's one thing. But I'm not committed in any way to any theological notion of it. Like the definition of validity, for example, or truth, and so on, or fact. Like anything, we have good reasons to define things a certain way. When we define fact as being justifiable to a degree of probability, there's good reason for that. So, how do we define good? Certainly reason is going to have something to do with it. We want to try to avoid fallacies and logical and not so logical mistakes. And we're going to have to take a position from our common experience. Right? We feel certain ways when people do things, and we think certain ways when people do things. And I think with our experience and our reason, no doubt that we can come to suitable definitions of what is good.
This is actually two questions in one. It says, if God is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, what separates it, assuming God, from nothingness? If nothing exists without cause, then how can God? And if God exists without cause, then why not the universe? This is again a category fallacy because you're saying what separates timeless, spaceless, and immaterial from nothingness, as if nothingness exists. Nothingness is the absence of everything. Nothingness doesn't have any properties. It doesn't have any traits. So you can't say that nothing is something and say, well, what makes the nothing different from God if God is timeless? And you're also assuming that nothingness, for example, something spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, if numbers exist, if you're a Platonist, which I'm still undecided on that, but I tend to lean that way, if you think numbers exist, the number is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. It's not made of matter. It's not in space or time, but if they exist, and they're spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. So to say what separates that from nothingness would be to imply that nothingness can be separated from as if nothingness exists. So as if nothing exists without cause, well, again, nothing doesn't exist, so skip the question. If God exists without cause, then why not the universe? The argument went everything that begins to exist needs a cause, and if God caused the universe, then by a logical deduction of that argument, if God created time, then he has to be timeless, and anything that is timeless is eternal because it never began. So it would be a logical contradiction to ask what caused God if he never began or had to come into existence. It would be like asking, to whom is the bachelor married to? You may not like the answer because you don't believe that God is timeless or that God exists, but that feelings do nothing to the validity of truth. The concept of God is that he is timeless, so he cannot begin. If you were to ask me, does a unicorn have a horn? I would say, sure it does. Now, if you were to ask me, does a unicorn exist? I say, unless you're talking about the rhinoceros, then no. So we can agree on concepts without saying that they exist. So the concept of God is that he is timeless, uncaused, unmoved, spaceless, immaterial, and so forth. So you cannot ask, why can't God exist without a cause? Because he didn't begin to exist.
I think we have time for two more questions.
From Mr. Sterno, if you are in the depth of despair, that is poverty, disease, lack of freedom, etc., who do you give thanks to for any relief? Who do you ask for any relief when your options are in life and have been limited since birth? That is, born into third world countries, born with severe disability, and so on. So, first of all, who do I ask for relief? Well, it's going to depend where I'm at, what I'm asking for relief from, and so on. It could be lots of things. Could be some extra cash, could be a certain type of drug, could be more education. It just sort of depends. Despair, something like that. Certainly, maybe a psychiatrist, something, and so on, some therapy. So it sort of depends, but certainly not anything supernatural. No reason to think that would do any good. Likewise, who do you give thanks to? Presumably, I wouldn't necessarily give thanks for a disease, but point taken. Who would I give thanks to? Who would I blame also? In a theological sense, nobody. It doesn't appear to me that would be any reasonable thing to do. Who I think, again, it would depend on the circumstances, the person putting me into poverty or so on. Or maybe chance. It just happened that way, in which to say, boo, whatever, might not make sense, but it doesn't mean we couldn't do something about it. Plenty of stuff to do about things like poverty and disease and so on.
Last question says, if God created the moral laws, which I don't believe he did, then how are those laws not just as subjective as the moral laws which individual humans created? I don't believe God created laws. I believe that they exist and are grounded in him, and because he is the good, what he says flows from his goodness. So it would be logically impossible. The concept of God is that it is logically impossible that he would command anything immoral, since he is the standard of morality. But again, the argument goes, to reiterate the argument of morality, if there is an absolute right or wrong, if there is objective moral values and duties, then they would need a grounding. So the argument goes, if God doesn't exist, then these things don't exist. I quoted two atheists, and I quote many more, who would say that, yeah, there's no such thing as morality, because God doesn't exist, but if morality exists, it would need a grounding such as God. So I'm not saying that God created morals. I'm saying that however we come to know morals, they have to exist outside of us. And if it is dependent on us, that would mean that if everybody in the world believes something, then it would be the case. But my point is, if everybody in the world, let's say Hitler won World War II, and everybody was brainwashed to believe it was okay to kill Jewish people, would that make it okay? If your answer is no, then you are assuming and asserting that objectivity and morality is not based on what humans think, which I would agree, it is based on something outside of humans. That is my point. That no matter what you think, if it is objective, it needs a grounding outside of us, because it is independent of our reasoning.
Thank you, Junior. This concludes our presentation tonight. If you would like to talk a little more, you can join them at the reception afterwards. We'll give them a round of applause.